What if the single most decisive day of World War II ended in catastrophe? What if the beaches of Normandy became graves, not gateways? This isn't just an alternate timeline, it's a buried reality that terrifies historians. D-Day was more than a battle. It was a gamble. And in this version, we lost. Step inside the classified nightmare they never wanted you to imagine. In the early years of World War II, the race for scientific supremacy was as fierce and vital as the battles fought on the ground. Among the most secret and urgent projects was the race to harness atomic energy as a weapon that could potentially end the war in an instant. But what if the Axis powers, specifically Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, had beaten the Allies to cracking the atomic bomb? How would the course of the Second World War have shifted, and what might the world have looked like afterward? In this alternate timeline, the discovery of nuclear fission takes a different path. In 1939, German physicists working under the direction of a clandestine branch of the SS make a breakthrough. Unlike in our history, where many top scientists fled Nazi persecution or resisted cooperation, this group manages to advance the uranium enrichment process rapidly. Thanks to a series of secret research labs hidden deep within the Black Forest and the Sudetenland, Germany begins producing enriched uranium by 1942. Simultaneously, in Japan, imperial scientists, encouraged by their alliance with Germany, accelerate their own nuclear research. With spies gathering intelligence from the West and German scientists secretly smuggled into the country, Japanese physicists create a small but workable nuclear device by late 1943. Their goal is clear: to use this ultimate weapon to solidify their Pacific dominance and force the United States into submission. By mid-1944, the Axis powers have not only developed atomic bombs but also perfected delivery mechanisms, rockets and bombers capable of striking strategic targets across the globe. Hitler's obsession with scientific superiority and his ruthless determination to win the war push him to deploy these new weapons without hesitation. The first target is London. On a cold autumn night in 1944, a mysterious explosion rips through the heart of the British capital. The blast obliterates the city's industrial and military centers, causing hundreds of thousands of casualties. The British government, shocked and demoralized, scrambles to respond. Their own nuclear program is still in its infancy, and the Allies have yet to develop a credible countermeasure. Across the Atlantic, the United States faces a terrifying new reality. The Japanese military, emboldened by their new power, launch a devastating nuclear attack on the naval base at San Diego. The surprise strikes cripple the Pacific Fleet and cause widespread panic. The once isolationist American public is thrown into chaos. President Roosevelt, determined but wary, orders an immediate and total mobilization for war. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, caught off guard by Germany's sudden nuclear leap, suffers heavy losses on the Eastern Front. Stalin's generals struggle to adapt to this unprecedented level of destruction. Entire cities like Kiev and Leningrad are reduced to radioactive wastelands. Despite this, the Soviets' massive manpower and unyielding resolve keep them fighting, but at a horrific cost. This new nuclear reality forces a redefinition of global strategy. The Axis powers' blitzkrieg tactics, combined with nuclear terror, disrupt Allied supply lines and force massive evacuations. The psychological impact on civilian populations is devastating. Fear of sudden nuclear annihilation becomes a tool of war itself, spreading terror far beyond the battlefields. In Germany, Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich seems closer than ever. But the use of atomic bombs is not without complications. The radiation sickness and contamination pose challenges even to Axis military forces, creating new logistical nightmares. Secret factions within the German military grow uneasy with the use of such apocalyptic weapons, fearing that total destruction is inevitable. On the diplomatic front, neutral countries scramble to respond. Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain engage in intense espionage and secret negotiations, hoping to avoid becoming the next targets of nuclear warfare. The United Nations, had it existed then, would have faced an unprecedented crisis of global security. Back in the United States, a fierce counterintelligence campaign attempts to infiltrate Axis nuclear programs. The famed Manhattan Project is accelerated, fueled by desperate scientific minds racing against the clock to develop a bomb capable of countering the Axis threat. But delays and sabotage hinder progress, and by early 1945, the Allies still lack a fully operational nuclear device. The decisive moment comes in late 1945 when the Axis powers launch a combined nuclear offensive aimed at New York City and Moscow, seeking to cripple the two largest Allied powers. The devastation is immense. Millions perish, and the political and economic systems of both nations are brought to their knees. But the Allies, with unparalleled resilience, mount a final push. Using a combination of guerrilla tactics, sabotage, and a newly deployed atomic bomb developed just in time, the Allies manage to strike back. The bomb is dropped on Berlin, causing massive destruction and dealing a psychological blow to Hitler's regime. Within weeks, Germany begins to crumble from within as internal dissent and chaos mount. The war ends, but the world is irreversibly changed. The horrors of nuclear war are no longer theoretical. They have become reality. Borders are redrawn in radioactive wastelands. Millions are displaced, and an era of cold mistrust and fear begins. This alternate history leaves haunting questions. What might the moral implications have been if Nazi Germany and Japan had controlled the ultimate weapon? Would the world have embraced peace sooner to avoid mutual destruction, or spiraled into further nuclear conflict? The legacy of this alternate World War II remains a chilling reminder of how close humanity came to annihilation, and how the balance of scientific power can tip the fate of entire civilizations. Operation Barbarossa, the massive Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union launched in June 1941, was arguably one of the most pivotal moments of World War II. It opened the Eastern Front, creating the largest theater of war in history, and ultimately became the beginning of the end for Hitler's ambitions. But imagine if this invasion never happened. What if Adolf Hitler, wary of a two-front war and concerned about the strength of the Red Army, decided to hold back? How might the Second World War, and the future of Europe, have unfolded? In this alternate timeline, Hitler focuses all his military might on the Western Front and the Mediterranean. After the fall of France in 1940, the Third Reich consolidates its hold over Western Europe. Instead of launching Barbarossa, German forces strengthened the Atlantic Wall, preparing for a prolonged siege against Britain, which remains defiant under Churchill's leadership. The Luftwaffe intensifies its relentless bombing campaign during the Blitz, aiming to crush British morale and infrastructure. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, remains intact and undisturbed, using the reprieve to continue massive industrial and military buildup. Stalin's purges, which in real history weakened his officer corps, are less intense in this timeline due to the absence of immediate war pressure, allowing the Red Army to retain a more experienced leadership. The USSR leverages the opportunity to improve its defenses and expand influence in Eastern Europe diplomatically, forging uneasy alliances with neighboring states. Without the titanic bloodbath of the Eastern Front, Nazi Germany is able to divert critical resources, troops, tanks, aircraft, westward. The Luftwaffe grows stronger, and the Wehrmacht becomes a more formidable force for an eventual invasion of Britain. The planned Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion of the British Isles, is given new life, with improved air and naval support. As 1942 arrives, the war in the West intensifies. The Royal Air Force faces an overwhelming German air assault, and the skies over Britain darken with constant dogfights. The British people endure relentless bombing and rationing, and the possibility of invasion looms larger than ever. The United States, still officially neutral but increasingly supportive of the Allies through programs like Lend-Lease, watches the escalating conflict with growing concern. On the diplomatic front, the Soviet Union walks a delicate path. Stalin uses the lull in conflict to extend Soviet influence into Finland, the Baltic states, and parts of eastern Poland through political pressure and covert operations. The balance of power in Eastern Europe shifts as puppet regimes sympathetic to Moscow emerge, creating a buffer zone that strengthens Soviet security. The absence of Barbarossa also affects the Holocaust's progression. The Nazi policy of extermination, tragically intensified during the Eastern Campaign, takes a different shape. While anti-Semitic policies persist in occupied Western Europe, the massive death camps in the East remain fewer and less industrialized. Some Jewish communities survive longer, but the overall scale of genocide remains horrific, just differently dispersed. By late 1942, the war reaches a critical point. Germany launches a massive assault against Britain from the air and sea. The Royal Navy suffers heavy losses, and German paratroopers attempt risky airborne landings in southern England. Britain's survival hangs by a thread. Yet, the British resistance, bolstered by intelligence breakthroughs and unwavering resolve, manages to thwart the invasion attempts. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, America's industrial output surges. The U.S. government ramps up military production in preparation for a potential direct entry into the war. President Roosevelt works to strengthen ties with Britain and the Soviet Union, despite the Soviets' ambiguous neutrality in this timeline. By 1943, the balance of power begins to shift again, but not due to a massive land invasion of Soviet territory. Instead, the Soviet Union starts a campaign of subversion and espionage within Nazi-occupied territories. With their industrial base intact and armies well prepared, the Soviets build a formidable intelligence network aimed at undermining German control from within. The prolonged conflict in the West takes a toll on German morale. The prolonged air war, supply shortages, and British resilience wear down the Wehrmacht. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, grows increasingly confident, though it avoids open conflict with Germany for now. In 1944, the Allies plan a different kind of offensive. Instead of the Normandy invasion facing a battered German army divided between East and West, the entire German military is concentrated on the Western Front. The Allies launch an amphibious assault, but it faces ferocious resistance. The Atlantic Wall is stronger, the German forces more prepared, and the battle drags into a grueling stalemate. In the East, the Soviet Union's power continues to grow, with expanded influence over Eastern Europe solidifying. Stalin's vision of a communist sphere of influence spreads without the destruction wrought by war. The Cold War begins not from direct conflict, but from an uneasy political standoff. Hitler's ambitions, although unfulfilled in invading the Soviet Union, still crumble under the prolonged pressures of a war on multiple fronts. By late 1944, internal dissent within the Nazi high command grows, as resources dwindle and the people grow weary. Ultimately, the war ends differently. The Allies defeat Nazi Germany not through overwhelming Eastern Front battles, but through a drawn-out war of attrition in the West combined with Soviet political pressure in the East. Europe emerges scarred, but with borders and power dynamics significantly altered. The absence of Operation Barbarossa shapes the 20th century profoundly. The Cold War begins earlier, characterized less by battlefield confrontation and more by political maneuvering and espionage. The devastation in the Soviet Union is far less, allowing it to emerge as a more stable and powerful superpower post-war. Western Europe rebuilds under different circumstances, with prolonged Nazi occupation influencing culture and infrastructure. This alternate history poses deep questions about the nature of warfare, ideology, and the human cost of decisions made by leaders. It reminds us that the greatest turning points often hinge on the choices not made, the roads not taken in the vast theater of history. The dawn of June 6, 1944, marked one of the most ambitious and critical military operations in history. The Allied invasion of Normandy, codenamed Operation Overlord, was the turning point that began the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi control. But what if that historic day had ended in failure? What if the Allied forces had been repelled, their plans shattered on the beaches of Normandy? This is the story of a world where D-Day did not succeed, and the consequences that followed. In this alternate timeline, the Germans, having intercepted more accurate intelligence about the invasion's timing and location, bolster their defenses along the Normandy coast with greater success. Rommel's Atlantic Wall is reinforced with additional troops, stronger fortifications, and more effective artillery placements. The Luftwaffe, recovering from earlier losses, mounts a coordinated air defense that severely hampers the Allied air superiority that was so crucial in reality. As dawn breaks on June 6, thousands of Allied soldiers hit the beaches under heavy fire. The chaos is overwhelming. Amphibious landings falter against concentrated machine gun nests, underwater obstacles, and well-prepared artillery positions. Paratroopers, scattered and disorganized, fail to secure key bridges and roadways, preventing effective reinforcement of the landing zones. The initial waves are decimated. Supply landings are disrupted, and the Allied commanders quickly realize that the beachheads are untenable. Attempts to push inland are met with fierce German counterattacks. By the end of the day, what was meant to be a foothold has turned into a costly stalemate. The failure of D-Day sends shockwaves through Allied command. General Eisenhower faces agonizing decisions as the hopes for a swift liberation of France are dashed. The Allies are forced to pull back, suffering heavy casualties and loss of material. Morale plummets not only among troops but also among civilians in occupied Europe who had pinned their hopes on the invasion. The Germans seized the opportunity to launch counteroffensives. Panzer divisions previously held in reserve are deployed to crush the weakened Allied forces stranded along the coast. The Atlantic Wall becomes an impregnable barrier once more. Hitler, buoyed by this stunning victory, orders his forces to pursue the retreating Allies aggressively, hoping to force a total withdrawal from Western Europe. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, still locked in brutal combat on the Eastern Front, watches the failed invasion with mixed feelings. Stalin contemplates whether to increase pressure on Germany from the east or take advantage of the Allies' setback to negotiate a separate peace deal. The uneasy alliance between the Western powers and the Soviets begins to show signs of strain. Back in Britain, the failure of D-Day reverberates deeply. Public opinion shifts as casualty lists grow, and the war drags on with no clear end in sight. Winston Churchill faces intense political pressure, while American support for the European war effort wavers amid growing casualties and uncertainty. The Pacific theater gains more attention as the priority shifts. With Normandy's beaches lost, the Allies are forced to reconsider their invasion strategy. Attempts to open new fronts, such as an invasion of southern France or Italy, are complicated by stretched supply lines and fierce Axis resistance. The Mediterranean remains a difficult battleground, and the German forces maintain control of key ports and infrastructure. As the months pass, the Holocaust continues unabated, with the Nazis emboldened by their victory. Deportations and mass executions accelerate in occupied territories. The world watches helplessly as the Nazi regime tightens its grip. In late 1944 and early 1945, the war reaches a grim stalemate in the West. The Soviet forces push relentlessly from the east but face stiffening German resistance in urban battles and fortified positions. Without the pressure of a Western Front invasion, Germany is able to divert troops and resources to the east, prolonging the conflict. The political landscape shifts as well. The failure of D-Day strains Allied relations, especially between the United States and Britain, as disagreements about strategy deepen. Roosevelt and Churchill disagree over whether to continue focusing on Europe or pivot more resources to the Pacific. The Axis propaganda machine exploits these rifts, sowing distrust among the Allies. In Germany, the victory at Normandy temporarily boosts morale, but internal divisions remain. Some Nazi officials warn Hitler that the war is still unwinnable, especially as Allied bombing campaigns continue to devastate German cities and infrastructure. Resistance movements within Germany grow bolder, inspired by the belief that the regime's hold on power is weakening. The prolonged war drags into 1946. Europe is a continent of shattered cities, refugee crises, and economic collapse. The cost of the failed invasion is measured in millions of lives and years of occupation. Eventually, the Allies mount a new invasion, but it is delayed by logistical challenges and political infighting. By the time a successful landing occurs, the Soviet Union has advanced deeper into Eastern Europe, and the post-war division of the continent takes a darker, more fractured shape. This alternate history shows how a single day, one pivotal moment, can alter the fate of millions. The failure of D-Day prolongs the suffering of countless civilians, shifts the geopolitical balance, and reshapes the map of Europe. It reminds us that the tides of history often depend on fragile decisions, luck, and the bravery of individuals caught in the storm of war. The Holocaust stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history, a systematic, industrialized genocide that claimed 6 million Jewish lives and millions of others. Yet, history's course is not fixed. What if the Holocaust had been stopped earlier, or at least significantly disrupted by timely intervention? How might the world have responded if key intelligence leaks or courageous acts had unveiled the Nazis' genocidal plans by 1942, triggering an international outcry and efforts to halt the atrocities? In this alternate timeline, the story begins with the courage of a handful of whistleblowers, scientists, diplomats, and resistance fighters, who managed to gather undeniable proof of the extermination camps and relay it to the Allied governments earlier than in real history. In 1942, the Allies received detailed documentation and photographic evidence exposing the scale of the Holocaust. Faced with this horrifying revelation, Allied leaders grapple with how to respond. Initially skeptical, they quickly come to understand that halting the genocide is a moral imperative. The British and American governments pressure the Soviet Union to prioritize rescue operations alongside their military campaigns. One of the first coordinated efforts is the establishment of covert rescue networks. Jewish and non-Jewish resistance groups across Europe intensify their work, helping thousands escape from ghettos and camps. Allied forces, rather than focusing solely on military objectives, incorporate missions aimed at liberating prisoners and disrupting Nazi death camp operations. The impact is profound. Camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka see their operations slowed or partially sabotaged. Underground rail strikes and attacks on supply lines delay deportations. News of the rescue efforts boosts the morale of oppressed communities and strengthens resistance movements across occupied territories. International public opinion shifts dramatically. Protests erupt in neutral countries, and governments face pressure to accept refugees. The United States, despite its immigration restrictions, relaxes quotas to allow Jewish refugees safe passage. In Palestine, the Zionist movement gains momentum with increased immigration and international support. The Nazi leadership, confronted with the global condemnation and mounting resistance, responds with brutal crackdowns. Yet, their ability to operate the extermination machinery diminishes. Some German military officers, horrified by the atrocities, quietly aid the resistance and help smuggle prisoners to safety. Meanwhile, the Allies integrate psychological warfare campaigns that expose Nazi crimes, weakening German morale and sowing dissent within occupied populations. Radio broadcasts and leaflets reveal the truth behind Nazi propaganda, and soldiers fighting on all fronts are made aware of the stakes beyond simple military victory. The war itself evolves under this shadow. While battles rage on land and sea, the liberation of persecuted peoples becomes a rallying cry. Soldiers from the Allied forces, many Jewish themselves, are inspired to fight with renewed determination. The moral clarity of the cause strengthens alliances and fosters unity among the disparate nations. The early disruption of the Holocaust also influences post-war geopolitics. The Jewish survivors and refugees, saved from near annihilation, play a vital role in establishing the State of Israel in 1948, with broader international recognition and support. The trauma of the genocide shapes global human rights discourse, leading to the creation of new institutions dedicated to preventing such atrocities in the future. Germany's defeat comes with a reckoning. Nazi leaders are swiftly prosecuted in international courts, their crimes known worldwide. The denazification process is more extensive, aiming to root out the ideology at every level of society. Yet, the scars remain. Millions of lives are still lost, families torn apart, and cultures shattered. But the earlier intervention prevents the complete obliteration of Jewish culture and communities in Europe. Holocaust survivors become powerful voices in the reconstruction of Europe and the promotion of peace. This alternate history asks profound questions about the power of knowledge, courage, and international responsibility. What might have been achieved if the world had acted sooner? How can humanity prevent such horrors from ever happening again? In the end, it is a story of hope amid horror, a testament to those who risked everything to save lives and challenge the darkest impulses of history. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the United States was thrust fully into World War II, turning the tide against the Axis powers. But what if the United States had maintained strict neutrality, refusing to join the war despite the attack? How would the conflict have evolved without American military and economic might tipping the scales? This alternative history explores a world where the U.S. stayed out, altering the fate of nations and the post-war order. In this timeline, political divisions and isolationist sentiment in the United States prove stronger. Despite the devastation at Pearl Harbor, public opinion and Congress refused to declare war. President Roosevelt, constrained by political opposition, opts instead for increased defense measures at home and intensified support to allies only through economic aid, avoiding direct involvement. Without American troops joining the fight, the Allies face immense challenges. Britain, already strained from years of bombing and siege, struggles to hold its lines. The British Commonwealth mobilizes all resources, but the absence of American reinforcements means that battles in North Africa, Italy, and Western Europe progress more slowly, with heavier losses. The Soviet Union, bearing the brunt of the Eastern Front, fights alone against the full might of Nazi Germany. Without the distraction of a second front in Western Europe, Hitler concentrates his forces against the USSR. Operation Barbarossa, having started as in real history, gains ground more rapidly as Germany reallocates troops previously earmarked for defense against a Western invasion. Japan, emboldened by the lack of American military response, expands aggressively across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Australia, New Zealand, and British colonies become prime targets. The Imperial Japanese Navy dominates the Pacific, capturing key islands and threatening Allied supply routes. Economically, the world is reshaped. The U.S. economy remains powerful but less militarized. Its manufacturing prowess supplies the Allies with material goods, but without American soldiers on the ground, the war's duration extends. The Lend-Lease program becomes the lifeline for the British and Soviets, but the strain wears on their capacity. In Europe, German forces consolidate their hold on occupied territories. Resistance movements persist, but without the logistical and air support provided historically by the Allies, their impact is limited. The Holocaust continues with tragic efficiency, as the Axis powers operate with less external pressure. By 1944, the Soviet Union faces a precarious situation. Moscow survives, but German advances push deep into Soviet territory. The brutal siege of Leningrad and the Battle of Stalingrad unfold with even greater ferocity. Stalin's calls for a second front go unanswered. In the Pacific, Japan establishes a vast empire stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. The Allied forces, mostly British and Australian, mount desperate counterattacks, but without American naval and air power, these efforts are costly and slow. The tide begins to shift only in 1945 when the British and Commonwealth forces, reinforced by a delayed but substantial influx of American volunteers and mercenaries, launch a renewed offensive in Western Europe. The Soviet Union, though battered, fights tenaciously in the East. The war drags into a grueling stalemate, with no decisive victory in sight. Diplomatically, the absence of the United States from the war effort causes cracks in Allied unity. Britain and the USSR distrust one another more deeply, each suspicious of the other's intentions in post-war Europe. The eventual defeat of Nazi Germany comes at a far greater cost in lives and territory. The war in the Pacific concludes even later, with the Japanese holding on to large territories. The eventual entry of American forces, pressured by growing public outrage and economic interests in 1945, helps to bring a final close to hostilities, but the delay means far more destruction and casualties. Post-war, the world order is drastically different. The United States emerges economically strong but politically isolated, its global influence diminished by years of neutrality. Europe lies in deeper ruin, and the Soviet Union's expanded territory and military strength make it a dominant superpower, setting the stage for an intense Cold War, perhaps even fiercer than in real history. The Holocaust survivors and Jewish refugees face harsher realities, as delayed liberation and prolonged Nazi control take their toll. The moral reckoning over the US's neutrality leads to deep national soul-searching. This alternate World War II underscores the profound impact one nation's choice can have on the fate of millions. It challenges assumptions about power, responsibility, and the delicate balance of alliances that shape history. The failure of D-Day wouldn't just change the war, it would change everything. The Holocaust prolonged. Europe divided. Democracy on the brink. In this dark mirror of history, heroes fall, tyranny rises, and hope flickers. And the most chilling part? It almost happened. Somewhere, Buried in classified reports and forgotten fears, this version of the world still lingers, waiting to be remembered.